Chapter 2 of The Amateur Immigrant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Amateur Immigrant by Robert Louis Stevenson. Early Impressions. We steamed out of the Clyde on Thursday night, and early on the Friday forenoon we took in our last batch of immigrants at Lofoyle in Ireland, and said farewell to Europe. The company was now complete, and began to draw together by inscrutable magnetisms upon the decks. There were Scots and Irish in plenty, a few English, a few Americans, a good handful of Scandinavians, a German or two, and one Russian, all now belonging for 10 days to one small iron country on the deep. As I walked the deck and looked round upon my fellow passengers, thus curiously assorted from all northern Europe, I began for the first time to understand the nature of emigration. Day after day through the passage, and thenceforth across all the States and on to the shores of the Pacific, this knowledge grew more clear and melancholy. Emigration, from a word of the most cheerful import, came to sound most dismally in my ear. There is nothing more agreeable to picture, and nothing more pathetic to behold. The abstract idea, as conceived at home, is hopeful and adventurous. A young man, you fancy, scorning restraints and helpers, issues forth into life, that great battle, to fight for his own hand. The most pleasant stories of ambition, of difficulties overcome, and of ultimate success, are but as episodes to this great epic of self-help. The epic is composed of individual heroisms. It stands to them as the victorious war which subdued an empire stands to the personal act of bravery which spiked a single cannon and was adequately rewarded with a medal. For in emigration the young men enter direct and by the shipload on their heritage of work. Empty continents swarm, as at the boatswain's whistle, with industrious hands, and whole new empires are domesticated to the service of man. This is the closet picture, and is found on trial to consist mostly of embellishments. The more I saw of my fellow passengers, the less I was tempted to the lyric note. Comparatively few of the men were below 30. Many were married and encumbered with families. Not a few were already up in years, and this itself was out of tune with my imaginations, for the ideal emigrant should certainly be young. Again I thought he should offer to the eye some bold type of humanity, with bluff or hawk-like features, and the stamp of an eager and pushing disposition. Now those around me were for the most part quiet, orderly, obedient citizens, family men broken by adversity, elderly youths who had failed to place themselves in life, and people who had seen better days. Mildness was the prevailing character, mild mirth and mild endurance. In a word, I was not taking part in an impetuous and conquering sally, such as swept over Mexico or Siberia, but found myself like Marmion, in the lost battle borne down by the flying. Labouring mankind had in the last years, and throughout Great Britain, sustained a prolonged and crushing series of defeats. I had heard vaguely of these reverses, of whole streets of houses standing deserted by the Tyne, the cellar doors broken and removed for firewood, of homeless men loitering at the street corners of Glasgow with their chests beside them, of closed factories, useless strikes, and starving girls. But I had never taken them home to me, or represented those distresses livingly to my imagination. A turn of the market may be a calamity as disastrous as the French retreat from Moscow, but it hardly lends itself to lively treatment, and makes a trifling figure in the morning papers. We may struggle as we please, we are not born economists. The individual is more affecting than the mass. It is by the scenic accident and the appeal to the carnal eye that for the most part we grasp the significance of tragedies. Thus it was only now, when I found myself involved in the rout, that I began to appreciate how sharp had been the battle. We were a company of the rejected, the drunken, the incompetent, the weak, the prodigal, all who had been unable to prevail against circumstances in the one land were now fleeing pitifully to another, and though one or two might still succeed, all had already failed. We are a ship full of failures, the broken men of England. Yet it must not be supposed that these people exhibited depression. The scene, on the contrary, was cheerful. Not a tear was shed on board the vessel. All were full of hope for the future, and showed an inclination to innocent gaiety. Some were heard to sing, and all began to scrape acquaintance with small jests and ready laughter. The children found each other out like dogs, and ran about the decks, scraping acquaintance after their fashion also. "What do you call your mither?" I heard one ask. "Maw," was the reply, indicating, I fancy, a shade of difference in the social scale. When people pass each other on the high seas of life at so early an age, the contact is but slight, and the relation more like what we may imagine to be the friendship of flies than that of men. It is so quickly joined, so easily dissolved, so open in its communications, and so devoid of deeper human qualities. The children, I observed, were all in a band, and as thick as thieves at a fair, while their elders were still ceremoniously manoeuvring on the outskirts of acquaintance. The sea, the ship, and the seaman were soon as familiar as home to these half-conscious little ones. It was odd to hear them, throughout the voyage, employ shore words to designate portions of the vessel. "Go away doon to yon dyke," I heard one say, probably meaning the bulwark. I have often had my heart in my mouth, watching them climb into the shrouds or onto the rails, while the ship went swinging through the waves, and I admired and envied the courage of their mothers, who sat by in the sun and looked on with composure at these perilous feats. "You'll maybe be a sailor," I heard one remark. "Now's the time to learn." I had been on the point of running forward to interfere, but stood back at that, reproved. Very few in the more delicate classes have the nerve to look upon the peril of one dear to them, but the life of poorer folk, where necessity is so much more immediate and imperious, braces even a mother to this extreme of endurance. And perhaps, after all, it is better that the lad should break his neck than that you should break his spirit. And since I am here on the chapter of children, I must mention one little fellow, whose family belonged to steerage No. 4 and 5, and who, wherever he went, was like a strain of music round the ship. He was an ugly, merry, unbreeched child of 3, his lint-white hair in a tangle, his face smeared with suet and treacle. But he ran to and fro with so natural a step, and fell and picked himself up again with such grace and good humour, that he might fairly be called beautiful when he was in motion. To meet him, crowing with laughter, and beating an accompaniment to his own mirth with a tin spoon upon a tin cup, was to meet a little triumph of the human species. Even when his mother and the rest of the family lay sick and prostrate about him, he sat upright in their midst and sang aloud in the pleasant heartlessness of infancy. Throughout the Friday, intimacy among us men made but a few advances. We discussed the probable duration of the voyage. We exchanged pieces of information, naming our trades, what we hoped to find in the New World, or what we were fleeing from in the Old. And above all, we condoled together over the food and the vileness of the steerage. One or two had been so near famine that you may say they had run into the ship with the devil at their heels, and to these all seemed for the best in the best of all possible steamers, but the majority were hugely contented. Coming as they did from a country in so low a state as Great Britain, many of them from Glasgow, which, commercially speaking, was as good as dead, and many having long been out of work, I was surprised to find them so dainty in their notions. I myself lived almost exclusively on bread, porridge, and soup, precisely as it was supplied to them, and found it, if not luxurious, at least sufficient. But these working men were loud in their outcries. It was not food for human beings. It was only fit for pigs. It was a disgrace. Many of them lived almost entirely upon biscuit, others on their own private supplies, and some paid extra for better rations from the ship. This marvellously changed my notion of the degree of luxury habitual to the artisan. I was prepared to hear him grumble, for grumbling is the traveller's pastime, but I was not prepared to find him turn away from a diet which was palatable to myself. Words I should have disregarded, or taken with a liberal allowance. But when a man prefers dry biscuit, there can be no question of the sincerity of his disgust. With one of their complaints I could most heartily sympathise. A single night of the steerage had filled them with horror. I had myself suffered, even in my decent second cabin berth, from the lack of air, and as the night promised to be fine and quiet, I determined to sleep on deck, and advised all who complained of their quarters to follow my example. I dare say a dozen of others agreed to do so, and I thought we should have been quite a party. Yet when I brought my rug up about 7 bells, there was no one to be seen but the watch. That chimerical terror of good-night air, which makes men close their windows, list their doors, and seal themselves up with their own poisonous exhalations, had sent all these healthy workmen down below. One would think we had been brought up in a fever country, yet in England the most malarious districts are in the bedchambers. I felt saddened at this defection, and yet half pleased to have the night so quietly to myself. The wind had hurled a little ahead on the starboard bow, and was dry but chilly. I found a shelter near the fire-hole, and made myself snug for the night. The ship moved over the uneven sea with a gentle and cradling movement. The ponderous organic labours of the engine in her bowels occupied the mind, and prepared it for slumber. From time to time a heavier lurch would disturb me as I lay, and recall me to the obscure borders of consciousness, or I heard, as it were through a veil, the clear note of the clapper on the brass, and the beautiful sea cry, "All's well." I know nothing, whether for poetry or music, that can surpass the effect of these 2 syllables in the darkness of a night at sea. The day dawned fairly enough, and during the early part we had some pleasant hours to improve acquaintance in the open air. But toward nightfall the wind freshened, the rain began to fall, and the sea rose so high that it was difficult to keep one's footing on the deck. I have spoken of our concerts. We were indeed a musical ship's company, and cheered our way into exile with the fiddle, the accordion, and the songs of all nations. Good, bad, or indifferent, Scottish, English, Irish, Russian, German, or Norse, the songs were received with generous applause. Once or twice a recitation, very spiritedly rendered in a powerful Scottish accent, varied the proceeding. And once we sought in vain to dance a quadrille, 8 men of us together, to the music of the violin. The performers were all humorous, frisky fellows, who loved to take capers in private life, but as soon as they were arranged for the dance, they conducted themselves like so many mutes at a funeral. I have never seen decorum pushed so far, and as this was not expected, the quadrille was soon whistled down, and the dancers departed under a cloud. 8 Frenchmen, even 8 Englishmen from another rank of society, would have dared to make some fun for themselves and the spectators. But the working man, when sober, takes an extreme and even melancholy view of personal deportment. A fifth-form schoolboy is not more careful of dignity. He dares not be comical, his fun must escape from him unprepared, and above all it must be unaccompanied by any physical demonstration. I like his society under most circumstances, but let me never again join with him in public gambols. But the impulse to sing was strong, and triumphed over modesty and even the inclemencies of sea and sky. On this rough Saturday night we got together by the main deck-house, in a place sheltered from wind and rain, some clinging to a ladder which led to the hurricane deck, and the rest knitting arms or taking hands. We made a ring to support the women in the violent lurching of the ship, and when we were thus disposed, sang to our heart's content. Some of the songs were appropriate to the scene, others striking the reverse. Master Doggerel of the musical hall, such as "Around her splendid form I weaved a magic circle," sounded bald, bleak, and pitifully silly. "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do," was in some measure saved by the vigour and unanimity with which the chorus was thrown forth into the night. I observed a Platt Deutsch mason, entirely innocent of English, adding heartily to the general effect. And, perhaps, the German mason is but a fair example of the sincerity with which the song was rendered; for nearly all with whom I conversed upon the subject were bitterly opposed to war, and attributed their own misfortunes, and frequently their own taste for whisky, to the campaigns in Zululand and Afghanistan. Every now and then, however, some song that touched the pathos of our situation was given forth, and you could hear by the voices that took up the burden how the sentiment came home to each. The anchors weighed was true for us. We were indeed rocked on the bosom of the stormy deep. How many of us could say with the singer, "I'm lonely to-night, love, without you," or "Go, some one, and tell them from me to write me a letter from home." And when was there a more appropriate moment for Auld Lang Syne than now, when the land, the friends, and the affections of that mingled but beloved time were fading and fleeing behind us in the vessel's wake? It pointed forward to the hour when these labours should be overpast, to the return voyage, and to many a meeting in the sanded inn, when those who had parted in the spring of youth should again drink a cup of kindness in their age. Had not Burns contemplated emigration, I scarce believe he would have found that note. All Sunday the weather remained wild and cloudy. Many were prostrated by sickness. Only 5 sat down to tea in the second cabin, and 2 of these departed abruptly ere the meal was at an end. The Sabbath was observed strictly by the majority of the emigrants. I heard an old woman express her surprise that the ship didna gae down as she saw someone pass her with a chessboard on the holy day. Some sang Scottish psalms, many went to service, and in true Scottish fashion came back ill pleased with their divine. "I didna think he was an experienced preacher," said one of the girls to me. It was a bleak, uncomfortable day, but at night, by 6 bells, although the wind had not yet moderated, the clouds were all wrecked and blown away behind the rim of the horizon, and the stars came out thickly overhead. I saw Venus burning as steadily and sweetly across this hurly-burly of the winds and waters as ever at home upon the summer woods. The engine pounded, the screw tossed out of the water with a roar, and shook the ship from end to end. The bows battled with loud reports against the billows, and as I stood in the lee scuppers and looked up to where the funnel leaned out over my head, vomiting smoke, and the black and monstrous topsails blotted at each lurch a different crop of stars, it seemed as if all this trouble was a thing of small account, and that just above the mast reigned peace, unbroken and eternal. End of chapter 2.